To unlock the secrets of a genius, the man who performed Einstein's autopsy stole his brain and kept it in a jar for 20 years. He found that the part of Einstein's brain that processes math and language was 15% bigger than the average human's. Throughout history, a total of 9 nuclear submarines have been lost around the world. Most of them are still on the ocean floor with nuclear weapons that are still intact. A 17-year-old boy from Mexico City died after his girlfriend gave him a hickey. The suction created a blood clot that traveled to his brain, eventually causing a stroke. When the Soviet Union was pushing toward Berlin during World War II, a Nazi SS soldier was forced to play piano for his captors. They made it clear to him in sign language that he would be executed the moment he stopped playing. He played for 22 straight hours, after which he collapsed in tears. They congratulated him, then shot him. This is a photo of a captive orca whale named Tilikum staring down its trainers at SeaWorld. There have only been 4 human deaths caused by orcas to date, and Tilikum was responsible for 3 of them. In one instance in 2010, 40-year-old Don Brancho leaned over his tank during something known as a relationship session. That's when the 11-ton orca took her in his mouth, dragged her into the water, and violently killed her in front of hundreds of terrified tourists. Even when SeaWorld staff members had trapped and netted him, Tilikum refused to let go of the body. It's believed his hostility was caused by a total accident that happened just minutes prior to the attack. Tilikum performed a trick that Dawn didn't see, so she didn't reward him with fish as she normally would. This, coupled with the psychological damage of living in captivity, resulted in the orca's unnatural aggression. As part of a fundraising publicity stunt in 1986, United Way released 1.5 million balloons in Cleveland, Ohio. But the event resulted in utter disaster since the balloons clogged various waterways and even shut down an airport. They also interrupted a Coast Guard search for 2 missing boaters who were later found to have drowned. As a sign of mourning, ancient Egyptians would often shave their eyebrows when their cats died. David Gaines earned 5 bachelor degrees at the same time at the University of Connecticut, but he sadly drowned and died just a few months after graduating because he never learned how to swim. If you ever have a kidney stone, just take a ride on Thunder Mountain in Disney World. After hearing rumors, a Michigan urologist took kidney models filled with stones on the ride. He found that the stones were passed up to 70% of the time depending on where he sat. Donda West was turned down by many plastic surgeons before she found one who would perform on her despite her heart condition. Sadly, as a result of the surgery, she died the next day, and Kanye has blamed himself ever since. The last French soldier to die in World War I was killed just 15 minutes before the ceasefire. He was trying to deliver a message to his unit that soup would be served for lunch. A man from Turkey locked his head in a cage for weeks in an attempt to quit smoking. His wife held on to the key and only opened it for meals and sleep. In 2014, General Motors recalled 2.5 million cars for faulty ignitions. The cars would literally shut off while being driven, so drivers would lose control of their brakes and airbags wouldn't deploy. GM knew about the problem since 2005, but never fixed it because it would be too expensive. And as a result, over 100 people died. This is the last known photo of Freddie Mercury before his death in 1991. In order to avoid the attention, Freddie denied rumors about having AIDS until the day before he died. During the Middle Ages, it was believed that sperm produced from the left testicle resulted in having a girl. So to ensure having a son, men would often have their left testicle removed in a painful surgery. In the 1960s, Canadian woodsman Francis Wharton shot a deer and made dentures out of its teeth. He then proceeded to eat the deer with the deer's own teeth. A cat named Oscar correctly predicted the deaths of over 50 patients at a nursing home in Rhode Island. Soon after he arrived at the home, staff noticed that Oscar chose to nap next to patients who would die a few hours later. Nurses would sometimes even place Oscar next to patients they thought would die, but he would move to other patients and be correct every time. Baby Molly Gibson was born in October of 2020, but she was technically 27 years old at her birth, just 2 years younger than her mom. Her embryo was donated in 1992 and stored in a liquid nitrogen tank until she was adopted in 2020 for in vitro fertilization. In 1994, a Russian pilot allowed his 16-year-old son to sit at the controls of the plane. But his son accidentally disabled the autopilot, crashing the plane and killing all 75 passengers on board. From the time of its discovery to its demotion, Pluto didn't even make one full revolution around the sun. If you hit someone with your car in China, you must pay for their medical care for the rest of their life. But if you kill someone with your car, you only have to pay a one-time fee. For this reason, it's common for people to go back and kill someone they accidentally hit. 19-year-old Australian Sam Ballard was a star rugby player until he was dared to eat a garden slug at a team party. The slug ended up infecting him with a condition called rat lungworm, which paralyzed him and eventually killed him 8 years later. In 2014, it was reported that Kim Jong-un killed his own uncle by throwing him into a cage filled with hundreds of stray dogs. In Berlin, Germany, there's now a playground on top of the site where Hitler allegedly killed himself during World War II. Serial killer and cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer was brutally killed in prison when another inmate beat him to death with a metal bar. The killer later revealed that he did it because he was sick of Jeffrey making the prison food look like severed limbs to tease the other inmates. Dutch passenger Cor Pan jokingly made this post just months after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 went missing. Little did he know his own flight would meet a similar fate, as MH17 was shot down over Ukraine, killing everyone on board. Hannibal of Carthage was famous for intimidating his Roman enemies through the use of war elephants. But the Romans eventually learned that elephants are afraid of squealing pigs, so they would lather pigs in tar and set them on fire, sending the enemy elephants fleeing in horror. This is where the term war pigs originated from. Playboy model Anna Nicole Smith didn't receive a single penny when her 90-year-old billionaire husband died. Oil tycoon J. Howard Marshall never included her in his will and left his $1.6 billion estate to his son. If you receive the wrong blood type for a transfusion, one of the symptoms is a sense of impending doom. In 1771, a Scottish woman was sentenced to death by hanging for the crime of hiding a pregnancy. Maggie Dixon was hung, declared dead, and carted off in a wooden coffin. She then suddenly woke up on the way to the graveyard and was later released since her sentence had been carried out. She lived for another 40 years, known as Half Hang It Maggie. In 1997, Bill Cosby's son Ennis was killed in a failed robbery attempt while he was changing a tire. Cosby was working toward his doctorate in special education and planned on building a school for children with disabilities. In 1971, a thief broke into a home and was shot in the legs by a trap set by the homeowner. The thief then sued the homeowner for damages and won. In 1999, a 26-year-old Polish man murdered his father with a screwdriver before making a mask out of his face. He then put on the mask along with his father's clothes and had his grandfather over for breakfast. Due to his poor hearing and eyesight, the old man swore he was talking to his son the entire time. The crime was only discovered when the grandfather found his son's body and called police. The killer was deemed clinically insane after claiming that the murder was an artistic work. A 42-year-old British woman received over $70,000 in donations after setting up a GoFundMe to fund her cancer treatment. But it turned out she was a total fraud and was instead using the money to fund her lavish lifestyle and gambling addiction. When Disney released Princess and the Frog, it caused a minor salmonella outbreak across the country. Over 50 kids were hospitalized after kissing a frog. The heaviest human ever recorded weighed 1,400 pounds at his peak. He once lost over 900 pounds only to gain it all back later in life. In the original Little Mermaid, the mermaid's feet constantly feel like she's walking on sharp knives. But the prince enjoys watching her dance, so she continues dancing for hours despite the excruciating pain. In the 1980s, Japanese film director Hideshi Hino made a gory horror film series called Guinea Pig. The effects he used were so realistic that Charlie Sheen thought he was watching people die for real and reported it to the FBI. Hino had to go to court to prove that the effects were fake and that all of the cast members were still alive. Astronauts need to sleep near a fan so that when they exhale, there isn't a CO2 cloud in front of their face that causes them to suffocate. Co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous Bill Wilson was denied after begging for whiskey on his deathbed and died 36 years sober. This is a photo of the Apollo 1 crew jokingly praying over a miniature of their command module. All three would die from a flash fire that swept through their actual command module in 1967. In 1912, President Teddy Roosevelt was shot in the chest just before giving a speech. Upon noticing the bullet missed his lungs, he carried on despite the blood seeping from his shirt. He delivered the full 90-minute speech before accepting medical attention. The first bomb dropped by the Allies during World War II killed the only elephant in the Berlin Zoo. Alfonso Flores from Texas received a major cosmetic surgery to increase his height from 5'11" to 6'1". He claimed it allowed him to finally achieve his dream of becoming tall. In 2009, Larry Maria Moncada from Iowa disappeared after working his shift at the supermarket. He was missing for more than a decade until his body was found when the supermarket was renovated. The man had fallen into a small gap between the wall and cooler, likely dying from dehydration after a few days of being stuck. In 2002, two airplanes collided over Germany, killing all 71 total passengers on board. 2 years later, the air traffic controller who was responsible was stabbed to death by a Russian man named Vitaly Kaloyev, whose wife and 2 kids were victims of the crash. Kaloyev was only sentenced to 2 years in prison and was hailed as a hero back in Russia. In 2019, a British teenager went blind after maintaining a horrendous diet for several years. It consisted of French fries, white bread, Pringles, and the occasional slice of ham. In 2013, Disney abandoned their policy of letting disabled people skip lines at their theme parks. This was because too many people were hiring disabled tour guides to help them skip the lines. These are photos of former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko before and after he was poisoned by Vladimir Putin in 2004. He and his family believe the assassination attempt was ordered because Yushchenko wanted Ukraine to integrate more with the rest of Europe. A doctor chronicled the progression of Alzheimer's disease in one of his patients by collecting her signatures on medical forms over the years. Ever since the Taliban takeover, the price for a kidney on the Afghan black market has dropped from $4,000 to $1,500. This is because so many people have been selling their own kidneys just so they can afford to feed their children. Such high supply of the organ has caused the price to plummet in short time. In 2014, Charles Manson was granted a license to marry 26-year-old self-proclaimed superfan Afton Burton. But the wedding was called off once it was revealed that Burton only wanted to marry him so that she could use his corpse as a tourist attraction once he died. The German pharmaceutical company that produces aspirin once marketed heroin as a pain remedy for children. The four-penny coffin was one of the first homeless shelters created by the Salvation Army in the late 19th century. For 4 pennies, you could receive food and shelter and could sleep in a coffin-sized wooden box with a tarp. On the right is a photo of the former girlfriend of serial killer Ivan Milat posing on a beach. Unbeknownst to her, she was wearing a sweater that belonged to one of Ivan's victims, which he gave to her as a gift. In the famous first edition of Playboy, Hugh Hefner published nude photos of Marilyn Monroe without her permission. He later purchased the crypt beside her even though they'd never met in life, and now he's buried next to her. The Great Smog of London in 1952 was so bad that pedestrians couldn't even see their shoes. It resulted in the deaths of 4,000 people, many of whom fell into the Thames River and drowned simply because they couldn't see it. In 1998, Tom and Eileen Lonergan were left behind during a diving trip in the Great Barrier Reef. It took 2 days for anyone to even notice before an extensive search was launched. 6 months later, their clothes and gear washed up along with a dive slate that read, "Please rescue us before we die." Their ultimate cause of death remains unknown since their bodies were never recovered. On Halloween in 1974, Ronald O'Brien laced his 8-year-old son's pixie sticks with cyanide so that he could claim the boy's life insurance. He also gave the candy to 4 other kids to set up the story that a local madman had poisoned them. Once police received word of the first boy's death, 3 of the 4 remaining candies were recovered quickly, but one was still out there. When the parents of this final child were informed by police, they became hysterical when they couldn't find the pixie stick in their son's bag. So they rushed upstairs to find the boy in his bed with the poisoned candy in his hand. He had thankfully been unable to open the wrapper because of the staple that was used to reseal it. So Timothy O'Brien ended up being the only confirmed case of a kid dying from poisoned Halloween candy, and it was done by his own father. Slovenian woman Julia Adlisic cut off her own hand with a table saw and purposely left it at home when she went to the hospital. She did this to receive $1.2 million in payout from the 5 insurance companies she signed up for. But instead of getting paid, she was sentenced to 2 years in jail for insurance fraud. Anyone who moves to Villas Las Estrellas in Antarctica must have their appendix preemptively removed because the nearest hospital is over 600 miles away. This is an image of a patient with claustrophobia who panicked during a CT scan. This little girl is the stepdaughter of serial killer John Wayne Gacy. Directly under her bedroom was the crawlspace where John stuffed the bodies of 26 of his victims, meaning she literally slept over a graveyard. In a 1974 art performance, Marina Abramovich told visitors she wouldn't move for 6 hours no matter what they did to her. She placed 72 items on a table and invited people to use them on her however they pleased with no punishment. There were objects for pleasure including a rose, perfume, and wine, as well as objects for pain including scissors, a whip, and a loaded gun. Visitors were gentle to begin with, but gradually got more aggressive as they became comfortable. Within 3 hours, all of her clothes had been completely cut off, and some people even started slicing her skin. One person even held the gun to her head until someone else took it away. Afterwards, Abramovich said, "If you leave it up to the audience, they can kill you." Colorado woman Cameron Newsom had half her tongue removed after her cancer diagnosis in 2013. After a 10-hour surgery, the infected portion of her tongue was replaced with skin and muscle from her thigh. Today, Newsom is cancer-free and healthy, other than the fact that her tongue can grow hair. The bodies of hypothermia victims are often found hidden in places such as closets, under the bed, or behind furniture. This is a primal evolutionary response called hide or die, which victims often experience minutes before death. Hiram Maxim, the inventor of the automatic machine gun, spent so much time test-firing his guns that he became completely deaf. His son Hiram Percy Maxim eventually invented the silencer, but it was too late to save his father's hearing. If you were to swim near a pod of narwhals and happen to hear one whistle, it might be the last thing that you ever hear. The sounds that narwhals make are so loud that they're said to be deafening to humans. In 2006, a 38-year-old woman who had been missing for 3 years was found dead in her London home with the TV still running. Cats have contributed to the extinction of at least 63 global vertebrate species. They're often considered to be one of the most environmentally damaging invasive predators on the planet. In 2018, a woman who received a lung transplant went into anaphylactic shock after eating peanuts even though she'd never been allergic before. She later discovered that the boy who gave her the lungs had a peanut allergy and actually died from anaphylactic shock himself. Brooke Greenberg was an American woman with an unknown condition called Syndrome X that prevented her from aging. She was 20 years old at the time of her death, but never developed physically or mentally past the age of 1. To make a sword from the blood of your enemies, you would have to kill over 300 people to get enough iron. The US military sends many of its doctors to Chicago to give them practice on gunshot wounds. During World War II, the Soviets tried to train dogs to run under enemy tanks with bombs strapped to their backs. However, this plan fortunately ended up backfiring for the Soviets. Because the dogs had been trained using Soviet tanks, many dogs ended up running to them during actual combat, blowing up friendly tanks instead. The details revealed in Michael Jackson's autopsy report were nothing short of disturbing. He was almost completely bald and had a number of cosmetic tattoos, including permanent eyeliner and lip liner. He had puncture wounds all over his arms and had nothing but pills in his stomach at the time of death. Michael had also undergone at least 10 nose jobs, leaving him with a left nostril that was almost completely collapsed. In 1963, the Bronx Zoo had an exhibit called The Most Dangerous Animal in the World. The entire exhibit was just a mirror. Serial killer Richard Chase once attempted to enter a woman's home but walked away after realizing her doors were locked. Chase later told detectives that he took locked doors as a sign that he wasn't welcome, but that unlocked doors were an invitation to come inside. In her Firefox search history, Casey Anthony had foolproof suffocation methods from the day before her daughter died. But police overlooked this evidence because they only checked her search history from Internet Explorer. Throughout his life, Ernest Hemingway survived malaria, anthrax, pneumonia, dysentery, skin cancer, diabetes, hepatitis, a ruptured kidney, spleen, and liver, a crushed vertebrae, and a fractured skull. He also survived 2 separate plane crashes in a 2-day span while on an African safari. In 2013, a French businessman died of a heart attack while having an affair with a stranger during a company trip. A French court ruled that this was an industrial accident and that his wife and family were entitled to compensation. Born in 1661, Charles II of Spain was the result of 200 years of inbreeding that intended to strengthen the family line. He was breastfed until the age of 4 and never fully learned how to walk. As an adult, he was completely illiterate and could barely chew or speak due to his deformed jaw. He was so ugly and disfigured that his own wife was terrified of him. In 2010, a Canadian man rescued a newborn baby from a dumpster only to find out that he was the father. In isolation wards where patients die alone, nurses fill gloves with warm water to simulate the touch of their loved ones. They call it the hand of God. In 1990, British Airways Flight 5390 experienced a window failure in the cockpit, causing the captain to be sucked out. But the crew held on to him for 20 minutes and he miraculously survived despite some frostbite and a few fractures. Female mummies in ancient Egypt were always more decomposed than their male counterparts. Researchers would later discover that this was because male bodies were embalmed a lot sooner than female bodies. Unlike male bodies, female bodies were kept at the family home until they started to decompose. The only reason this was done was to prevent the embalmers from getting weird with the bodies. Children who are victims of hot car deaths are often found with large portions of their hair ripped out. The only reason dogs love squeaky toys is because they sound like little animals dying. Every unborn baby grows a mustache in the womb, which then spreads to cover the entire body. The baby then eats this fine hair called lanugo, then excretes it after birth with their first bowel movement. A Dutch teenager who was going bungee jumping in Spain died after a horrible misunderstanding. The instructor, who had poor English, said no jump, but she heard it as now jump and ended up jumping straight to her death. This is exactly why commands are never supposed to be given with a no or a don't. President JFK's convertible wasn't scrapped when he was assassinated in 1963. They just welded a roof on top, and it was used by the next 4 presidents right up until 1977. Of all the atrocities committed during World War II, few compared to the gruesome experiments performed by Japanese Unit 731. It was a biological warfare research unit that conducted on unwitting subjects who were often prisoners of war. Some of the earlier, more mild experiments involved injecting pathogens such as anthrax and cholera into subjects. But as the war intensified, their trials became increasingly extreme. For example, they left babies in the freezing cold and blew people's legs off with grenades to see how long it would take them to die. In one experiment, scientists peeled the skin off of living people to learn how much skin you could peel off before killing someone. At least 3,000 subjects were experimented on, and all of them died. And perhaps worst of all, the researchers of Unit 731 were granted immunity by the US in exchange for the horrific data they gathered. In 1987, Kenneth Parks drove 12 miles to his mother-in-law's house and stabbed her to death in the middle of the night. But he didn't receive any jail time because Parks' lawyer was able to prove that he was sleepwalking the entire time. The bolt at the top of a helicopter shaft that holds it all together is called the Jesus nut. It got its name because if it fails in flight, the only thing left to do is to pray to Jesus. Viking warriors who were badly wounded were given onion soup to test whether or not they would survive. Someone would smell the wounds after a few minutes, and if onions were detected, it meant that death was imminent. Pedro Lopez is a Colombian serial killer who was sentenced in 1980 after murdering more than 300 young girls. But after serving 18 years in Ecuadorian prison, he was released on good behavior in 1998, and his current whereabouts are unknown. In 2003, Kenneth Maxwell called 911 to report a house fire that he came across while driving home from work. But his voice suddenly cut off during the call, and when firemen arrived at the scene, Kenneth was found shot dead in his car. It turned out the fire was created to cover up a double homicide, and the killer saw Kenneth making the call. Morticians often use these spiky contacts to keep the eyes of the dead closed during funeral viewings. During World War II, one of the first Japanese cities that the US planned on nuking was its former capital, Kyoto. The only reason it wasn't bombed was because US Secretary of War Henry Stimson spent his honeymoon there and thought it was a nice place. So instead of Kyoto, they went with Nagasaki. Contrary to what was reported at the time, Ronald Reagan lost more than half his blood and came within seconds of dying when he was shot in 1981. His true condition was concealed from the public for nearly 30 years. In an average lifetime, human skin completely replaces itself more than 900 times. A Russian woman named Kristina Ozturk is addicted to having kids and vows to have over 100 by the time she turns 30. She's only 23 years old and already has 11 kids with her 56-year-old husband. In 1967, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov became the first person to die in space. His craft had over 200 known flaws, but his attempts to delay the flight were rejected. Had he refused the mission, his friend Yuri Gagarin would have been sent instead. Vladimir specifically asked the authorities to give him an open casket funeral after the mission.